Hey guys, welcome back. Thanks for joining us today on The King of Random. In the past, we've had a few videos using silicone rubber to make a mold of an object we already had and then cast it in a new kind of material. This is a great way to make a copy of something that you already have. We had a comment request from Hund Oni Stress as saying you should take a vinyl record and cast it in silicone, then pour epoxy or resin in the mold to see if it sounds the same. Well, Hund Oni Stress as, we think this is a great idea. So we have a vinyl record and a record player. We're going to try making a silicone mold of the record and then cast it in resin to see if we can get a playable copy. First, we have to test that our vinyl record will play. This is a record of some Mozart music. It can be fun messing with the settings on a record player. All right, we now know our record plays well, so it's time to start prepping it to be molded so we can cast a copy of it. I have some oil-based clay and I'm going to be using that to make a border wall that goes around our record that will hold it in when we pour it onto the record so it doesn't flood the whole table. There's a slight chance that the vinyl record will try to float on the silicone, so I'm also going to use a little bit of clay on 4 points around the edges of the record to try and hold it down to the table. These little bits of clay will show up in our casting, which is too bad, but I don't know another way to make sure that our record doesn't go anywhere. They should easily trim off and they shouldn't affect the playing of the music at all. With the record secured in place, I'm now going to take some more clay and make a wall that runs all the way around it. Now let's mix up some silicone to pour onto our record. Because we don't want this to go too quickly and we want to make sure it gets into all the tiny grooves of the record, I am using the green catalyst, which is much slower. Now we want to make sure that we get all of the air bubbles out of this silicone, so let's throw it in the vacuum chamber and start sucking. Silicone should now be almost entirely bubble free. I'm just gonna clean off the record really quick and then we'll start pouring it on. Probably more official ways you're supposed to clean records, and someone out there is furious with me for using a paper towel. All right, I think that's pretty good. Let's add our silicone. I'm starting by pouring the silicone right into the middle to let the rubber just sort of flow over the record. That's usually a good method to get it to get into all of the tiny little cracks and grooves. Encourage it a little bit here. At this point, our record is completely covered and our silicone is still going to keep flowing a little bit and reach the very edges and settle itself down into a nice flat surface. This type of silicone and catalyst should take at least 12 hours to cure, so we'll come back tomorrow and see how our mold has turned out. Our first layer of silicone is cured and dry, and we could take it off now, but I want to be able to reinforce it just a little bit, so I am going to add another layer of silicone over the top of it to make it a little thicker and hopefully a little smoother. This layer of silicone isn't going to be in contact with the record at all, so it doesn't matter if it's as bubble-free and perfect as the last one. So I'm not going to use the vacuum chamber on it, and I'm going to use the red, faster-acting catalyst. This layer of silicone should only take about 45 minutes to cure, so once it's ready, we'll demold the record. Start by peeling all of the clay off and get it out of the way. This is an oil-based clay. It doesn't dry out, so this is still good to just save and use for another project. Ooh, that's coming off really nicely. Oh, beautiful. So if you get in really close, you can see the ridges from the record all the way around. All of the tiny little grooves are visible in the silicone. Let's just trim off the extra on the middle here. With our record successfully molded, I have two different types of resin that I'm going to try using to cast this record. The two types of resin I'm using look pretty similar, but this type takes about 15 to 20 minutes to cure and harden, and this type takes up to 24 hours. So I'm going to try both of them and see if we get any sort of good playable result from either one. I'm going to start with the fast-acting resin. This mixes together in a 1-to-1 ratio, so equal parts of both. But first, I'm going to lay down some protective cover because there's a good chance some of the resin will spill off of the record mold and onto the table. We also want to make sure that our mold is clear of any dust or dirt. Now before I start mixing and pouring my resin, I am going to take a little bit of the oil-based clay and try and add some barriers where I have these marks in the silicone. This is just in an effort to make sure that the resin doesn't run down through those gaps and onto the foil too much, because I do need it to build up on the record a little bit. And the clay isn't really going to stick to the silicone much, but hopefully it will stay on there enough to make a difference. Now I'm going to pour the first half into the second half and mix it up. This resin does start to cure pretty quickly, so I'm gonna have to be fairly quick in my mixing. All right, I think that's pretty well mixed. Now I'm gonna pour it onto the mold. My resin is already starting to thicken up a little bit. Not pouring out of the cup as easily as it was when I started. Yeah, originally it was like a warm syrup. Oh, there we go. It's barely even liquid anymore. Now the resin in the cup had more mass of the resin all stuck together. As a result, its own heat would speed up the catalyzation process, turning it rigid. The resin on the record mold is a lot more spread out, so it's not holding heat as well, so it's not catalyzing quite as quick. You can see that while this is basically solid at this point, it's still flexible, but it's not sticky anymore. These little drips over here are still quite gummy and even a little bit liquid. So let's give this resin 15 to 20 minutes to cure before we take it out of the mold, clean up the edges, and fix the hole in the center before we see if it will play on our record player. All right, our resin is now mostly cured. It's definitely cured enough that I feel comfortable pulling it out of the mold. Let's see how it turned out. Now while the resin is still a little bit soft, I'm going to try and use a razor blade and trim off these excess spillage areas. Some interesting parts visible where there were a lot of bubbles near the surface. That's one of the downsides of this type of resin. It does tend to get a lot of bubbles, and because it catalyzes so quickly, there isn't time to put it in a vacuum chamber. All right. I'm going to try putting our original record down onto the player and then put our cast record on top of that. The original record should hold it rigid enough that it stays flat. Right there. A little lower down on. It's playing! It's playing! Oh my gosh! It's worse audio quality, definitely. Listen to all those crackles and pops. Scratchy stereo noise is getting in there, interference definitely, but it's playing on our molded and cast record. Oh man, that's so cool. Oh, the audio quality is so much worse. It's making scratching sounds every second, but that's so cool. I think it's also quieter, interestingly enough. I'm gonna try to play the same spot on both the copy and the original. It's gonna be a little tricky, but we'll try. There in the blank spot. Well, it does play. It's a playing record. That is so funny. Oh my gosh. So I didn't really have a lot of high hopes that this resin would work very well. It casts very quickly it gets fairly warm, and I didn't think it would pick up quite enough detail to really be able to make out that it was music. I thought maybe we would get some scratchy noises from it, but the fact that we can definitely tell what music is being played is amazing. We have achieved a level of success with our first casting. Now we're going to try our slower resin, which is actually going to get put in the vacuum chamber to remove all of the bubbles, and then it takes as much as 24 hours to cure. We start out the same way by mixing up even portions of our side A and side B resin. I've also got a new color that I'm going to try adding to this resin. All right, I'd say that's now evenly mixed. You can see how many bubbles mixing it introduced into that resin. It's just completely full of bubbles at this point. That's why we're going to throw it in the vacuum chamber and suck them all out. I'm not sure if this one will get high enough that I have to drop it or not. It's not super consistent with this resin. You can see some of the bubbles starting to get pulled out. Oh, excellent. Didn't have to drop the pressure at all. Now it's just sucking air out of the resin. Looks like boiling candy. Actually looks a lot like when we made the candy for the thumb suckers. Looks pretty much just like the boiling sugar. There are still a few bubbles rising up, but I think at this point that's just the alcohol from the ink dye that I used boiling in the low pressure. So I'm going to slowly let some air back in, see what happens to all those bubbles. I bet they just disappear. Try and get to the very edge on all the parts of the record this time so we don't have that little gap that we had on our first casting. All right, I think that's going all the way to the edges everywhere. It is spilling out in a couple of spots, but that shouldn't be a big problem. It does look like right here it's probably a little bit thin. You can maybe see that the green of the silicone is showing through a little bit more right there, but it is still covered, and I think it will still turn out just fine. And now our second type of resin is cured. I did have something odd happen. I pointed out where there was a thin spot in the resin. While it was curing, a hole did form in that thin spot on the mold. I mixed up a small second batch of the clear resin and I poured that on as a sort of patch where it had gone so thin that you could actually see the silicone right through it. And then I reinforced a couple other small spots that looked like they were pretty thin as well. But at this point, everything's cured and it's ready to be demolded. All right, let's see. Oh, looks like it's coming off the actual record just fine, which is what we were hoping for. Right, here you can see the patch where I filled in the gap, and I didn't use any yellow dye in this spot, so that's why we have sort of a clear spot in the middle. And then you can see a little bit of the texture around the edges where it was spread. It doesn't like to spread super nice and thin. But I don't think that should affect the playing because that's just on the back side. On the front, it's just perfectly smooth, looks like uninterrupted record, just like you would want to see it. On the power, lay our record down. It is, I think, maybe not 100% cured. It feels like it might be a little flimsy, but it's not much different from an actual vinyl record. So we'll try it without putting the actual vinyl record underneath it for support, see how it goes. Not bad. It's playing pretty well. There's a little bit of static in the background, but there's not nearly as much of the popping and crackling that happened with our first test. I think we definitely got a much better result with this second resin. I'm gonna move it and see what happens if it goes right over the thin spot. Doesn't really seem to be affecting it any, I don't think. It sounds about normal. Maybe there is a little warble as it hits it. Just as a test, I'm going to try putting the normal record underneath our casting just to make sure it stays up nice and flat and is held in place. There you go, that is working pretty darn well, I'd say. Like I said, there's a little bit of static noise, more than the original. There you have it. You can make a mold of a record and cast it in resin and make something that plays, which is incredible to me, especially that this first one worked. I didn't think this first resin would be high enough quality that it would get the detail to really pick up the sound, but it did. You can absolutely tell what music is playing on both records. Our second slow cure resin did give us a better result, but the first one's not terrible. Special thank you to YouTuber Hundone Stress As for your suggestion that we try this. Check your YouTube inbox, we're sending you 25 bucks. Remember that if you have any cool ideas you want to see us try, let us know down in the comments. If we use your idea for a video, we'll send you $25. I'm really happy I got to try this experiment with you guys. Thanks for joining us for this project, and we'll see you in the next one. Talk to you then. This is probably the least efficient and most expensive form of music piracy ever invented. I drew on the foil, the resin spilled over it, and it just lifts it right up. I got a gold record! Woo!
Hey guys, it's Grant here. I just want to pop in and say hello. You guys are wonderful. Nate and I are incredibly grateful for the way you keep supporting us. So that's pretty much it. Just wanted to give you a quick thank you. I'll see you in the next video.